The sweet scent of fresh flowers filled the air of the historic synagogue, mingling with the comforting smell of freshly lit candles. Leah took a deep breath, feeling the soft fabric of her wedding dress brush against her skin. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the bouquet of white roses and lavender, a last-minute gift from her grandmother. The low murmur of the guests echoed off the old stone walls, creating an atmosphere of expectation and excitement. Leah looked down the aisle in front of her, decorated with flower petals and silk ribbons, leading to the richly ornamented chuppah where Daniel, her fiancé, awaited her. As she prepared to take the first step, Leah couldn't help but think of the contrast between this moment and her childhood in the poor Jewish neighborhood of her hometown. She remembered the narrow streets, the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery, and the constant sound of children playing on the cracked sidewalks. The soft melody of the violin announced her entrance, and all eyes turned to her. Leah moved forward slowly, her heart beating hard against her chest. She saw Daniel at the end of the corridor, tall and elegant in his tailored suit, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of love and something she couldn't decipher. Anxiety, perhaps? Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. As she approached the chuppah, Leah picked up fragments of whispered conversations between the guests. Can you believe it? An ordinary girl marrying one of the richest men in the country. I heard they only met 6 months ago. It must be true love, right? Leah ignored the comments, concentrating only on Daniel. When he finally reached her side, he took her hand, and she felt the strength and warmth of his fingers intertwined with hers. The rabbi began the ceremony, his deep voice echoing through the synagogue. Leah listened to the ancient words, feeling the weight of generations of tradition on her shoulders. She looked at Daniel, momentarily losing herself in his deep brown eyes. As they exchanged vows and rings, Leah couldn't help thinking about how her life had changed so drastically in such a short time. A year ago, she was struggling to make ends meet, working as a substitute teacher and studying for her master's degree in her spare time. Now, she was marrying a man whose fortune was almost unimaginable to her. The sound of glass breaking under Daniel's foot marked the end of the ceremony, and the synagogue erupted in applause and shouts of Mazel Tov. Leah felt dizzy with happiness as she and Daniel ran down the aisle, now husband and wife. The reception that followed was more extravagant than anything Leah had ever seen. The ballroom of the luxury hotel sparkled with thousands of lights, reflected in the silverware and crystal goblets. The air was filled with the aroma of gourmet dishes and the sound of a live orchestra playing traditional Jewish music mixed with contemporary classics. As she danced with Daniel, twirling around the room in her silk and lace dress, Leah couldn't help but notice the contrast between this sumptuous celebration and the simple parties of her youth. She remembered the weddings at the local community center, with homemade food and music from a local DJ. There was joy and love at those celebrations, just as there was here, but the scale was completely different. "Are you happy, my love?" Daniel whispered in her ear, pulling her closer. Leah smiled, leaning her head against his chest. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, and it was true. Despite the grandeur of the event, despite the curious and sometimes envious stares of the guests, what mattered most was the man in her arms. As the evening progressed, Leah found herself observing the guests. There were familiar faces, her family, a few friends from college, but most were unknown to her. Executives in expensive suits, women with jewelry that probably cost more than the apartment she grew up in, politicians and celebrities she had only seen on TV. This was Daniel's world, she realized, a world of which she was now a part. Close to midnight, exhausted but happy, Leah followed Daniel to the bridal suite. The room was an oasis of luxury, overlooking the twinkling lights of the city. Daniel kissed her softly, his hands caressing her face tenderly. "I love you, Leah," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I promise I'll do everything in my power to make you happy." Leah smiled, lost in the depth of his eyes. "I love you too, Daniel. More than words can express." They were about to kiss again when Daniel's cell phone rang, the shrill sound breaking the moment. She noticed an immediate change in his expression, a shadow passing across his eyes, his jaw clenching slightly. "Sorry, darling," he said, stepping away. "I need to take this. Business, you know." Leah nodded, watching as he went out onto the balcony, closing the glass door behind him. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he gestured rapidly as he spoke. When Daniel returned minutes later, his face was composed, but Leah could sense a subtle change in his demeanor. There was a new urgency in his movements, a distraction in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Is everything all right?" she asked, the concern evident in her voice. Daniel smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course, my love. Just a few last-minute details about a business deal. Nothing to worry about." He kissed her again, and for a moment, Leah forgot her worries, lost in the passion of the kiss. But when they finally parted for the night, she couldn't help noticing that Daniel remained awake long after she had fallen asleep, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his mind clearly elsewhere. Leah fell asleep with a slight feeling of unease, not knowing that when she woke up the next morning, her life would have changed forever. The morning sun filtered softly through the silk curtains, casting a golden glow over the luxurious room. Leah stretched languidly, a smile on her lips as memories of the night before flooded her mind. She turned, reaching out to touch Daniel, but her fingers found only the emptiness of cold sheets. "Daniel?" she called, her voice still hoarse from sleep. Silence. Leah sat up, blinking away the sleep from her eyes. Daniel's side of the bed was untouched, the covers perfectly arranged as if he had never slept there. A shiver ran down her spine as her eyes scanned the room. Daniel's suit was no longer hanging on the chair where he had left it the night before. His suitcase had also disappeared. Her heart racing, Leah stood up, calling Daniel's name as she checked the sweet, spacious bathroom and living room. Nothing. No sign of him. Not even a note. Panic began to settle in her chest, a suffocating sensation that threatened to engulf her. She reached for her cell phone, frantically dialing Daniel's number. The call went straight to voicemail. "Daniel, where are you?" Her voice shook as she left a message. "Please call me as soon as you hear this." "I'm worried." Hastily dressing in the first clothes she could find, Leah went downstairs to the hotel reception. The lobby was still decorated with flowers from the wedding, a cruel reminder of the happiness she felt just a few hours ago. "Good morning, Mrs. Goldstein." The receptionist greeted her with a polite smile. "How can I help you?" "My husband," Leah said, her voice trembling. "Daniel Goldstein. Have you seen him this morning?" The receptionist's smile faltered. "Actually, yes. Mr. Goldstein left the hotel around 4 a.m. He seemed in a hurry." Leah felt as if the ground had disappeared from under her feet. "Did he say where he was going? Did he leave a message for me?" "I'm sorry, ma'am. He didn't say anything. He just ordered a cab and left." The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic phone calls and unanswered messages. Leah contacted all of Daniel's friends and family that she knew, but no one had heard from him. Every missed call, every unanswered message increased her desperation. As the day progressed, Leah found herself sitting alone in the bridal suite, surrounded by unopened wedding presents and slowly wilting bouquets of flowers. The contrast between the joy of the day before and the terror of the present was almost unbearable. It was then that she decided to go to Daniel's mansion. Perhaps there she would find some clue, some explanation for his sudden disappearance. The cab dropped her off in front of an imposing gate. Leah entered the code Daniel had given her, and the gates opened silently. The mansion rose up in front of them, an imposing structure of glass and steel that looked cold and impersonal in the evening light. Inside, the house was a monument to modern luxury, but Leah barely noticed the expensive furniture or the works of art on the walls. Her eyes were searching for signs of Daniel, for anything that might explain where he had gone. In Daniel's office, she found the door locked. Frustrated, Leah pressed her forehead against the cold wood. What was going on? Why had Daniel disappeared without a trace the day after their wedding? The sound of the doorbell echoed through the empty house, making Leah jump. Her heart raced. Was it Daniel? She rushed to the door, hope and fear battling in her chest. But it wasn't Daniel. Two policemen were standing in the doorway, their faces serious. "Mrs. Goldstein?" the older of the two asked. When Leah nodded, he continued. "I'm Detective Ramirez, and this is my partner, Detective Johnson. May we come in? We have some questions about your husband." Leah led them into the living room, her mind spinning. Why were the police involved? What was going on? "Mrs. Goldstein," Detective Ramirez began, his tone gentle but firm. "When was the last time you saw your husband?" "Last night," Leah replied, her voice trembling slightly. "On our wedding night. When I woke up this morning, he was gone." The detectives exchanged glances. "And how long have you known Mr. Goldstein?" 6 months, Leah replied, suddenly aware of how that sounded. "We got married yesterday." "Mrs. Goldstein," Detective Johnson intervened, his voice cautious. "We're conducting an investigation into some discrepancies in your husband's finances. Are you aware of any of his business activities? Leah felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Discrepancies? What kind of discrepancies? We can't go into details at the moment, Ramirez said. But it's important that we know if you've noticed anything unusual recently. Any strange behavior, suspicious phone calls, unexpected trips? Leah's mind flashed back to the night before, to the phone call Daniel had received. The tension in his shoulders, the urgency in his voice. Was it possible? No, she couldn't believe it. She didn't want to believe it. No, she finally said. Nothing unusual. The detectives asked a few more questions before leaving Leah with a card and instructions to contact them if she remembered anything important. Alone again, Leah sank onto the sofa, her head spinning with unanswered questions. Who was Daniel really? Why had he disappeared? And what did the police suspect he had done? As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, Leah found herself staring at a photo of her and Daniel taken on their first date. Their smiles were bright, full of promises of a happy future together. Now, looking at the picture, Leah wondered if she really knew Daniel. The sound of his cell phone snapped her out of her thoughts. It was an unknown number. Her heart racing, Leah answered. Hello, Mrs. Goldstein? An unfamiliar male voice spoke from the other end of the line. My name is Jonathan Stern. I was your husband's lawyer. Was, Leah repeated, feeling a new fear settle in her stomach. I've been instructed to contact you in case of certain eventualities, Stern continued, his voice carefully neutral. There's information I need to share with you. Information about bank accounts and other matters. What kind of matters? Leah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Stern spoke again, his voice had a warning tone. Mrs. Goldstein, my advice is not to ask questions. The less you know, the better. For your own safety. The phone slipped from Leah's trembling fingers, falling to the floor with a thud. She stood there, frozen, as the reality of her situation hit her full force. Her husband had disappeared. The police were investigating him. And now, a mysterious lawyer was telling her not to ask questions for her own safety. What kind of nightmare had she woken up in? And most importantly, how was she going to find out the truth about the man she had married? Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. The sun had barely risen when the mansion's doorbell rang, rousing Leah from a restless sleep. She got up from the sofa where she had fallen asleep, still dressed in her clothes from the day before, and staggered to the door. Two detectives, different from the ones she had met the day before, were standing on the threshold. Mrs. Goldstein? We're from the Financial Crimes Division. We need you to come with us for a few questions. The interrogation lasted for hours. In a cold, impersonal room at the police station, Leah found herself bombarded with questions about Daniel, their relationship, their finances. Mrs. Goldstein, are you aware of your husband's business activities? Asked Detective Oliveira, a middle-aged woman with piercing eyes. Leah shook her head. He never went into details. He said I'd better not worry about it. And that didn't strike you as odd? Oliveira's partner, Detective Santos, pressed. Leah hesitated, remembering moments that once seemed insignificant, but now took on new meaning. Daniel abruptly changing the subject when she asked about his work. Late-night phone calls that he answered in private. I trusted him, Leah replied, her voice trembling slightly. The detectives exchanged glances. Mrs. Goldstein, Oliveira said softly, we have reason to believe that your husband was involved in an extensive money laundering operation. The funds of several of his companies cannot be traced. The words hit Leah like a punch in the gut. She remembered Daniel's smiling face, his promises of eternal love. How could that be true? No, she whispered. There must be some mistake. Santos slid a folder across the table. These are records of suspicious transactions linked to your husband's companies. Millions of dollars moved through offshore accounts, investments in shell companies. Leah looked at the documents, the numbers dancing before her eyes. It was as if she was reading about a stranger, not the man she had married just 2 days before. When she was finally released, it was late at night. Leah staggered out of the police station, feeling exhausted and disoriented. The city streets looked different now, full of shadows and secrets. When she got home, Leah was greeted by a flurry of messages and missed calls. Friends, family, even some reporters, all wanting to know about Daniel's disappearance and the charges against him. But one message stood out. It was from Rachel, his best friend since childhood. Leah, I saw the news. I'm on my way there now. You shouldn't be alone. Minutes later, Rachel arrived, her arms full of food and a bottle of wine. Without saying a word, she hugged Leah, who finally let the tears fall. I don't understand, Rachel, Leah sobbed. How could I not see it? How could I marry someone I barely knew? Rachel gently guided her to the sofa. Leah, you fell in love. Sometimes love blinds us. As they ate and drank, Leah told Rachel everything that had happened in the last 48 hours. The dream wedding, the shocking disappearance, the disturbing revelations. I feel so stupid, Leah muttered, swirling the wine in her glass. Everyone must be laughing at me. The poor girl who thought she'd found her prince charming. Rachel took Leah's hand. Hey, you're not stupid. Daniel fooled everyone, not just you. The question now is, what are you going to do? Leah looked at her friend, feeling a determination growing inside her. I need to find out the truth. Not just for me, but for everyone Daniel may have hurt. With Rachel's help, Leah began to search the house, looking for any clues that Daniel might have left behind. It was in the locked office that they made their first shocking discovery. After picking the lock, they found a room that looked like something out of a spy movie. An open safe revealed passports with different names, all with Daniel's photo. Wads of cash and various currencies were scattered across the table. My God, Rachel whispered. Who is this man you married? Leah picked up one of the passports, her fingers trembling. I don't know, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm going to find out. As they rummaged through the documents, Leah came across a photo that made her freeze. It was Daniel, smiling next to serious-looking men in expensive suits. She recognized one of them, a prominent politician who had been accused of corruption the previous year. Rachel, Leah called out, her voice shaking. Look at this. While they were examining the photo, Leah's cell phone rang. It was the unknown number from before. Mrs. Goldstein, Attorney Stern's voice sounded. I need to see you right away. It's about your husband's accounts. Leah hesitated, looking at Rachel. Her friend nodded encouragingly. All right, Leah replied. Where are we meeting? Half an hour later, Leah was sitting in a discreet cafe, Rachel at her side as moral support. Jonathan Stern was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and an expensive suit. Mrs. Goldstein, he began, his voice low. What I'm about to tell you is extremely confidential. Your husband has instructed me to provide you with access to certain bank accounts in the event of your disappearance. He slid an envelope across the table. Here are the details of the accounts. They're offshore accounts, untraceable. There are millions of dollars in them. Leah looked at the envelope as if it were a poisonous snake. Why would he do that? Why give me access to possibly illegal money? Stone sight. Mrs. Goldstein, my advice is that you don't ask questions. Use the money to protect yourself, to rebuild your life. The less you know about your husband's activities, the better. Leah felt a wave of anger rise up inside her. No, she said firmly. I deserve to know the truth. Who is Daniel really? What has he done? The lawyer looked around nervously before leaning closer. Mrs. Goldstein, there are powerful people involved in this. People who wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who poses a threat. Please take my advice and stay out of it. With those words, Stern stood up and left quickly, leaving Leah and Rachel staring at the envelope on the table. What are you going to do? Rachel asked softly. Leah looked at her friend, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. I'm going to find out the truth, no matter what the cost. Daniel owes explanations not only to me, but to everyone he's deceived. As they left the cafe, Leah didn't notice the man sitting in the corner, watching her intently over his newspaper. As soon as she had gone, he picked up his phone. She knows, he said simply. What do we do now? On the other end of the line, a familiar voice answered. Keep an eye on her. We can't let her find out anymore. If necessary, we'll take more drastic measures. Night fell over the city, enveloping Leah in a cloak of secrets and dangers that she had barely begun to comprehend. As she made her way home, she was unaware that every step took her deeper into a web of lies and betrayals that threatened not only her heart, but her very life. Dawn found Leah sitting at the kitchen table, eyes red from a sleepless night, a cup of cold coffee forgotten in front of her. Scattered across the table were the documents she and Rachel had found in Daniel's office, along with the envelope Stern had given her. Each piece of information was like a piece of a macabre puzzle, revealing a picture that Leah could barely comprehend. Bank accounts in tax havens, shell companies, connections to underworld figures. Who was this man she had married? The sound of a notification on her cell phone snapped her out of her thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. Stop searching. Some truths are too dangerous. A shiver ran down her spine. Leah looked out of the window, suddenly aware that she might be being watched. The shadows in the streets seemed more threatening now, hiding secrets and dangers. Determined not to be intimidated, Leah picked up her phone and called Rachel. "I need your help," she said as soon as her friend picked up. "We're going to visit Daniel's ex-employee who I mentioned yesterday." An hour later, Leah and Rachel were standing in front of a modest apartment in the suburbs of the city. Mark Thompson, Daniel's former personal assistant, opened the door cautiously, his eyes wide with fear as he recognized Leah. "Mrs. Goldstein," he stammered, I didn't expect to see you here." "Mark," Leah said firmly, "I need to know the truth about Daniel. What did he really do?" Thompson glanced nervously over Leah's shoulder, as if expecting to see someone watching them. "Not here," he whispered. "Meet me in the park in an hour. I'll tell you what I know." In the park, sitting on a secluded bench, Thompson spoke in a low voice, his eyes constantly scanning the area. "Daniel wasn't just a businessman," he began. "He was a facilitator. He connected powerful people, moved money around, made problems disappear." Leah felt her stomach turn. "What kind of problems?" Thompson swallowed. "The kind of trouble that involves millions of dollars in bribes, influence peddling, even, well, there have been rumors about worse." Rachel, who had remained silent until then, intervened. "Why are you telling us this now? Why didn't you go to the police?" The man laughed bitterly. "Do you think the police don't know? Some people are too powerful to be touched. And those who speak out, well, they tend to disappear." The words hung in the air, laden with menace. Leah felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath her feet. "Daniel's disappearance," she began hesitantly. "Do you think?" Thompson nodded somberly. "He must have crossed the line with someone even more dangerous than him. Or maybe he decided it was time to get out of the game." As they walked back to the car, Leah noticed a man in a dark suit watching them from afar. When their gazes met, he quickly looked away and walked away. "Rachel," Leah whispered, "I think we're being followed." The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoia and fear. Every sudden sound, every shadow on the street corners, seemed like a potential threat. Leah alternated between moments of fierce determination to find out the truth and periods of overwhelming doubt. In the evening, alone at home, Rachel had reluctantly agreed to leave after much insistence from Leah. She found herself staring at a photo of her wedding. Daniel's beaming smile, the sparkle in his eyes. How could it all have been a lie? A sudden noise downstairs made her freeze. Silent, almost imperceptible footsteps. Someone was in the house. Heart racing, Leah grabbed the first object she could find, a heavy golf trophy of Daniel's, and moved silently towards the stairs. Shadows danced on the walls, fed by the moonlight coming through the windows. When she reached the foot of the stairs, she saw a figure moving in the darkness of the living room. Without thinking, Leah turned on the lights and brandished the trophy. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice shaking with fear and adrenaline. The figure turned, and Leah almost dropped the trophy with shock. It was Daniel. He looked different, thinner, with an unshaven face and deep circles under his eyes. His eyes, once full of warmth and affection, were now cold and wary. "Leah," he said softly, "I'm sorry." For a moment, Leah was paralyzed, a storm of emotions, relief, anger, confusion, threatening to engulf her. Then anger won out. "Are you sorry?" she shouted, stepping forward with the trophy still raised. "You disappear the day after our wedding, leave me in the middle of a nightmare of lies and crimes, and all you have to say is, 'I'm sorry'?" Daniel held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Leah, please. I know you must have 1,000 questions, but we don't have much time. Dangerous people are after me, us." "What people?" Leah demanded. "The same ones you helped with your work? The corrupt politicians? The criminals?" Daniel's expression darkened. "How did you?" "It doesn't matter. Yes, those people. Leah, I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But I'm trying to make things right now." Leah lowered the trophy, but kept her distance from Daniel. "Fix it how? By disappearing? Leaving me to deal with the mess you've created?" "I was trying to protect you," Daniel insisted. "The less you knew, the safer you'd be. But now," he hesitated, glancing nervously out of the window. "Now, we need to go. It's not safe here." "Go," Leah echoed, incredulous. "Do you really think I'd go anywhere with you after all this?" At that moment, the sound of screeching tires outside caught both their attention. Headlights illuminated the front windows, and male voices could be heard approaching the house. Daniel's face paled. "They've found us." "Leah, I know I have no right to ask this, but you need to trust me now. Your life depends on it." Leah looked from Daniel's anxious face to the front door, where shadows were already moving. In a matter of seconds, she would have to make a choice that could change the course of her life forever. Trust the man who had betrayed her, but who now seemed genuinely concerned for her safety. Or face whatever was on the other side of that door. The sound of breaking glass in the kitchen made the decision for her. "Where to?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to consume her. Daniel grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the back of the house. "There's a car waiting in the alley. Let's go." As they ran through the night, leaving behind the sound of doors being kicked in and furious screams, Leah couldn't help but think she was jumping from the frying pan into the fire. But as the adrenaline coursed through her veins and the city passed in a blur through the windows of the car, one thing became clear. Her search for the truth had only just begun, and the cost of that truth could be greater than she had ever imagined. The car sped through the dark night, its headlights briefly illuminating deserted roads and desolate landscapes. Leah remained silent in the passenger seat, her body tense, her mind spinning in a whirlwind of contradictory emotions. Daniel drove with his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. The silence between them was palpable, laden with unasked questions and unrevealed truths. "Where are we going?" Leah finally broke the silence, her voice sharp as a blade. "To a safe place," Daniel replied, without looking away from the road. "I can't explain any more details now. It would be too risky." Leah felt a wave of anger rise up inside her. Too risky? As if the last few days hadn't already been a nightmare of risks and lies. Daniel sighed, an expression of weariness and guilt crossing his face. "Leah, I know I have a lot of explaining to do, but now is not the time." The next few hours were a silent drive through back roads, away from the main highways. Leah watched the landscape change, from busy suburbs to increasingly isolated rural areas. Her mind revisited the moments of her relationship with Daniel. Each memory, once golden and full of promise, now seemed tainted with doubt. The expensive gifts, the sudden trips, the secret phone calls, it all made sense now. "Why did you marry me?" The question escaped his lips, more of a whisper than a statement. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Initially, as part of a plan. You were convenient. A young Jewish woman of humble origins, with no political or business connections. Perfect for creating a facade of normality." The words hit him like a punch. Leah felt tears of anger and humiliation burn her eyes. "So it was all a lie? Our love, our moments together?" "No," Daniel said quickly. "Not completely. Over time, my feelings became real. You were different from what I expected. Stronger, more intelligent." Before Leah could reply, Daniel slowed down. Up ahead, a small isolated hut stood out against the darkness of the night. Dense trees surrounded the property, creating a feeling of total isolation. "Where are we?" Leah asked, a new fear growing in her chest. "A safe house," Daniel replied. "Prepared for years for emergency situations. No one but me knows this place exists." Inside the hut, the environment was surprisingly organized. Maps covered in transparent plastic took up an entire wall. State-of-the-art computers were arranged on a metal table. Weapons, pistols, rifles were carefully organized in a security cabinet. "What's all this?" Leah asked, her voice a mixture of fear and fascination. Daniel began to explain. He wasn't just a criminal, as Leah had imagined. He was an undercover agent, working for years to dismantle an international network of corruption involving politicians, businessmen, and mafias. "My every move," he said, "every transaction, every relationship, everything was calculated to get closer to the truth, including our marriage." Leah stared at him, a storm of emotions in her eyes. Anger, betrayal, but also a trace of admiration for the complexity of his plan. "And now?" she asked. "Now," Daniel replied. "We need to get ready. They're going to hunt us down. And they won't stop until they find us." The night advanced. While Daniel prepared equipment and checked communication systems, Leah allowed herself a moment's reflection. How had she gotten there? From a young teacher with simple dreams to the center of an international espionage and crime plot? A special phone, different from conventional cell phones, rang. Daniel answered quickly, speaking in codes that Leah didn't understand. His normally controlled face showed signs of concern. What happened? Leah asked when he hung up. Our pursuers are closer than we thought, Daniel replied. We need to prepare for a possible invasion. As he spoke, Leah watched. The man she loved, who had betrayed her trust, but who was also risking everything for a greater mission. His emotions were a minefield of contradictions. Love, anger, betrayal, admiration, fear. How could I trust him again? How could she believe any word that came out of his lips? And yet, something inside her knew that Daniel was her only chance of survival at the moment. The night promised to be long, and their fate completely uncertain. The rising sun cast long shadows across the small clearing where Daniel's hut was hidden. Leah watched from the window, her tired eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign of movement. The last 48 hours had been a roller coaster of emotions and revelations, leaving her exhausted but hypervigilant. Daniel emerged from the basement, carrying a heavy backpack. We have to move, he said, his voice tense. It's not safe to stay in one place for too long. Leah turned to face him, crossing her arms. And where are we going now? Another secret cabin? Another hideout full of weapons and spy equipment? Daniel sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Leah, I know you have every reason not to trust me, but don't trust you. Leah interrupted, her voice rising. Daniel, you've lied about everything. Our relationship, our marriage, your identity. How can I believe anything you say now? For a moment, silence hung between them. Daniel looked older, more tired than Leah had ever seen him. You're right, he finally said. I've lied about a lot of things, but not about how I feel about you, and not about the danger we face now. Before Leah could reply, Daniel's secure phone vibrated. He answered it quickly, his face growing paler with every second of the conversation. What is it? Leah asked as soon as he hung up. My contact at the agency, Daniel replied, moving quickly to collect more equipment. The situation is worse than we imagined. The corruption goes deeper, reaches higher levels of government. Leah followed him, helping to pack supplies almost instinctively. What does this mean for us? It means we can't trust anyone, Daniel said, checking a pistol before stowing it in a hidden holster. Not even the people I thought were on our side. As they prepared to leave, Leah couldn't help but notice how efficiently they worked together, despite everything. It was as if years of lies and secrets had been momentarily set aside in the face of imminent danger. Back in the car, driving along back roads, Daniel explained more about the situation. The network of corruption he was investigating was just the tip of the iceberg. It involved politicians of the highest rank, judges, even agents of the very organization Daniel worked for. That's why I had to disappear after our wedding, he said, eyes fixed on the road. I discovered something big, something that could bring down the whole corrupt system. But I also realized that I was being watched. Leah absorbed the information, her mind working to process everything. What about me? Where do I fit into all this? Daniel hesitated before answering. In the beginning, you were part of my cover. An ordinary wife, with no suspicious connections. But then what? Leah pressed. Then I really fell in love, Daniel admitted, his voice low. And I realized that I had put you in danger. Before Leah could reply, a familiar sound caught her attention. Helicopters. She looked through the rearview mirror and saw two black dots rapidly approaching in the sky. Daniel, I heard it, he replied, accelerating the car. Hang on. What followed was an intense chase through the winding forest roads. Daniel maneuvered the car with surprising skill, while Leah clung to the seat, her heart racing. Who are they? She shouted over the roar of the engine. Probably a cleaning crew, Daniel replied, making a sharp turn. Sent to silence us permanently. Suddenly, the road ahead was blocked by a black car. Daniel braked sharply, turning the wheel to avoid a collision. The car skidded off the road and plunged into the dense vegetation. For a few tense moments, all Leah could hear was the sound of branches breaking and metal twisting. Then silence. Leah, are you all right? Daniel's worried voice brought her back to reality. She nodded, feeling pain all over her body, but nothing serious. I'm fine. And you? I'll live, he replied, already working his way out of the damaged car. But we have to move. They'll be here any minute. They had barely moved a few meters from the car when they heard voices approaching. Daniel pulled Leah behind a large tree, pressing her against the trunk and covering her mouth with his hand. Armed men ran past them, so close that Leah could smell their uniforms. She held her breath, feeling the warmth of Daniel's body pressed against hers. When the men moved away, Daniel let out a sigh of relief. "We have to keep moving," he whispered. "There's a safe place a few kilometers from here. If we can get there." Leah interrupted him, grabbing his arm. "Daniel, wait. Before we go any further, I need to know. This whole situation, all these dangers, is it worth it? What exactly have you discovered that is so important?" Daniel stared at her, his eyes intense and serious. "Leah, what I've discovered could change everything. Corruption at the highest level, rigging elections, embezzlement on a global scale. If we can expose it, we can bring down the whole corrupt system," Leah concluded, beginning to understand the magnitude of the situation. Daniel nodded. "Exactly. But the road there will be dangerous. Very dangerous. Leah, I would understand if you wanted to leave now. To find a safe place, to restart your life away from it all." Leah stared at him for a long moment, weighing up her options. Her whole life had been turned upside down. She was tired, scared, and still hurt by Daniel's lies. But she also knew that what they were doing was bigger than themselves. "No," she finally said, her voice firm. "I'm in this until the end. Together." A smile of relief and admiration crossed Daniel's face. He took Leah's hand, squeezing it gently. Together, then. As they walked deeper into the forest, Leah knew they were heading into the eye of the storm. The danger ahead was greater than anything they had ever faced. But for the first time since all this madness began, she felt a spark of hope. The climax was approaching, and with it, the chance to finally uncover the whole truth and make a difference. Leah only hoped that they would survive to see the outcome. The dense forest swallowed up the sounds of their hurried footsteps. Leah and Daniel advanced quickly, adrenaline propelling them through the thick vegetation. The distant hum of helicopters echoed above the treetops, constantly reminding them of the danger that was stalking them. "How much further?" Leah gasped, pushing a branch aside. Daniel consulted a small device on his wrist. "Less than a kilometer. The bunker should be just ahead." Leah nodded, concentrating on keeping pace. Her mind wandered between the tense present and the revelations of the last few days. Each step took her deeper into a world of secrets and dangers that she could barely comprehend. Suddenly, Daniel stopped, raising his hand in a warning gesture. Leah froze, her heightened senses picking up on the slightest movement around her. A branch snapped in the distance. "We're not alone," Daniel whispered, pulling Leah behind a wide tree. Seconds later, two armed men ran past them, so close that Leah could smell sweat and gunpowder. She held her breath, her heart hammering so hard she feared it might be heard. When the men moved away, Daniel signaled for them to continue. They moved even more cautiously now, each step calculated to make as little noise as possible. Finally, they reached a small clearing. In the center, almost invisible under layers of vegetation and camouflage, was a metal hatch. "This is it," Daniel said, moving quickly to enter a code on a hidden panel. The hatch opened with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a ladder that descended into darkness. Daniel signaled for Leah to enter first, keeping guard as she descended. The interior of the bunker was surprisingly spacious and well-equipped. Computer screens covered an entire wall, displaying news feeds, maps, and what appeared to be confidential documents. "What's all this?" Leah asked, looking around in amazement. Daniel began to activate systems, the screens coming alive with data and images. "This is the command center. From here, we can access all the information I've collected over the last few years." Leah approached one of the screens, her eyes wide at the amount of information. Names of prominent politicians, astronomical figures, secret documents. It was all there. "Daniel," she said slowly, it's unbelievable. How did you get all this?" He turned to face her, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. "Years of undercover work. Infiltrating criminal networks, hacking government systems, negotiating with high-ranking informants. Every piece of information here can bring down entire governments." Leah felt the weight of the situation fall on her shoulders. "What now? What do we do with it all?" Daniel moved to another console, entering a series of commands. "Now we prepare everything for mass dissemination. Every newspaper, every TV network, every social media platform. Everyone will receive this information simultaneously." A sudden alarm echoed through the bunker, making Leah jump. Daniel rushed over to one of the monitors, his face paling. "They've found us," he said, his voice tense. "We've got less than an hour before they make their way here." Leah felt a shiver run down her spine. "An hour? Is that enough time to get everything ready?" Daniel shook his head. "It's going to be tight. And even if we manage it, We'll still have to survive long enough to make sure the information gets out. The next few minutes were a frantic race against time. Daniel worked furiously on the computers, preparing the data for transmission, while Leah, following his instructions, helped set up the bunker's security systems. "Leah," Daniel called out, without taking his eyes off the screens. "In the cupboard to your left. There's a pendrive-like device. Take it." She obeyed, finding a small metal object. "What is it?" "Our plan B," Daniel replied. "If something goes wrong, if we can't transmit from here, this device contains all the information. It has its own transmission system, but it needs to be out in the open to work." Leah held the device tightly, feeling its weight. Not just physical, but the weight of responsibility it represented. The sound of distant explosions reached them, making the bunker shake slightly. "They're getting closer," Leah said, fear evident in her voice. Daniel nodded, his expression grim. "We're almost there. Just a few more minutes." As Daniel finalized the preparations, Leah couldn't help but reflect on her journey. Just a week ago, she was an ordinary teacher, about to marry the man she loved. Now she was at the center of a global conspiracy, with the fate of nations literally in her hands. "Daniel," she called softly, "if we can pull this off, if this information comes to light, what happens then?" He paused his work, turning to face her. His eyes were tired but determined. "Honestly, chaos. The world as we know it will change drastically. Governments will fall, corporations will collapse. It will be a period of turbulence like we've never seen before. But in the end," he continued, "we will have the chance to rebuild, to create a fairer, more transparent system." Leah absorbed his words, feeling the weight of responsibility. "And what about us? What happens to us?" Daniel approached her, taking her hands in his. "Leah, I can't promise that we'll be okay. There are too many powerful people who will do anything to silence us. But I promise that, no matter what happens, I will do everything in my power to keep you safe." The moment was interrupted by another explosion, this time much closer. The bunker lights flashed. "It's now or never," Daniel said, quickly turning back to the main console. Leah watched, her heart in her throat, as Daniel started the transmission sequence. The screens around them came to life, showing progress bars and complex codes. "Is it working?" she asked anxiously. Daniel nodded, a strained smile on his face. "Yes, the transmission has started. Now we just need to keep the system online for more." His words were cut off by a deafening bang. The bunker door, which had seemed impenetrable, began to deform under the impact of explosives. "They're here," Leah whispered, fear evident in her voice. Daniel moved quickly, grabbing a gun and positioning himself between Leah and the door. "Remember the device," he said urgently. "If something goes wrong, if the transmission is interrupted, you need to take it to the surface." Leah clutched the small object in her hand, feeling its weight like never before. She looked at Daniel, at the man who had turned her life upside down, the man she loved despite everything. "Together," she said, moving to stand next to him. Daniel nodded, a mixture of pride and concern in his eyes. Together. The bunker door began to give way, the metal groaning under the pressure. Leah and Daniel braced themselves, knowing that the next few moments would determine not only their fates, but potentially the fate of the entire world. The climax was coming, and with it, the moment of truth. The metal of the bunker door groaned and contorted under the force of the explosions. Leah and Daniel were crouched behind a reinforced table, weapons in hand, their eyes fixed on the entrance that was about to give way. "How much longer?" Leah whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the explosions. Daniel quickly checked the nearby console. "Another 3 minutes to full transmission. We need to hold on." Just then, the door finally gave way with a deafening bang. A cloud of dust and debris filled the air, and through it, armed silhouettes began to enter. "Now!" Daniel shouted, activating a switch. Instantly, an automated defense system went into action. Jets of non-lethal gas flooded the entrance, while sonic devices emitted disorienting sound waves. The invaders staggered, some falling to their knees, others retreating in confusion. But it was only a temporary measure. "Leah," Daniel said urgently, "there's an emergency exit behind that panel. If things get too bad, I want you to take the device and run." She stared at him, determination in her eyes. "I'm not leaving you here." Before Daniel could reply, one of the invaders, wearing some kind of protective mask, advanced through the gas mist. Leah reacted instinctively, firing her gun. The man fell backwards with a muffled scream. "Good shot," Daniel muttered, impressed. More invaders began to enter, this time prepared for the bunker's defenses. The air filled with the sound of gunfire and shouts. Leah and Daniel moved in sync, as if they had trained together for years. She covered one side, he the other, protecting the consoles that still transmitted crucial information. Amidst the chaos, Leah noticed a familiar face among the attackers. "Daniel," she shouted. "It's Stern." Jonathan Stern, the lawyer who had met Leah days ago, was at the back of the group of attackers, shouting orders and pointing. Daniel cursed softly. He must be the link between the criminals and the government. We need to take him alive, he knows too much. The battle intensified. Leah felt the heat of the bullets passing close by, the smell of gunpowder filling her lungs. Every second seemed like an eternity. 2 minutes, Daniel shouted, checking the console again. Just then, a larger explosion shook the bunker. Lights flashed and some of the equipment sparked. No, Daniel muttered, running to the main console. The transmission is unstable. We need to reroute the power. Leah immediately understood the gravity of the situation. If the transmission failed, everything would have been for nothing. Tell me what to do, she said, determined. Daniel quickly explained a series of complex commands. Leah moved to a secondary console, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she tried to ignore the chaos around her. A cry of pain made her turn around. Daniel had been shot in the shoulder, blood staining his shirt. "Daniel," she shouted, moving to help him. "No," he replied, pressing on the wound. "Continue with the transmission. It's more important." With a heavy heart, Leah turned her attention back to the console. Every second was crucial. Meanwhile, the invaders were gaining ground. They were getting closer and closer, and Leah and Daniel's options were running out. 1 minute, Daniel announced, his voice tense with pain and worry. At that moment, Stern stepped forward, a cruel smile on his face. "It's over, Daniel," he said. "You've lost. Hand over the dice and maybe, just maybe, we'll let you both live." Daniel laughed bitterly. "Do you really think we'd believe that, Stern? After everything?" Stern shrugged, his smile not faltering. "It's worth a try. But you're right, of course. You know too much to be left alive." As Stern spoke, Leah noticed something in the corner of the bunker. A small, almost imperceptible drone, hovering silently. Her heart leapt when she recognized the logo of a major international news network. Somehow, the media had found them. They were broadcasting everything live. Leah exchanged a quick glance with Daniel, who had also noticed the drone. A silent plan formed between them. "You know, Stern," Daniel said, his voice louder and clearer. "You should have checked that no one else was watching." Confusion flashed across Stern's face for a moment, before he followed Daniel's gaze and saw the drone. His face paled. "Take it down," he shouted to his men, but it was too late. Leah took advantage of the distraction to finish the transmission. "Ready," she shouted. At that very moment, the cell phones of everyone in the bunker, including the invaders, began to vibrate and ring. Breaking news notifications flooded the screens. What have you done?" Stern stammered, looking in panic at his own phone. Daniel smiled despite the pain. "We've just exposed you and your entire corrupt network to the whole world, Stern. It's all there, every illegal transaction, every bribe, every name involved." Chaos broke out among the invaders. Some dropped their weapons in shock. Others started arguing among themselves. Stern looked like a man who had seen his world crumble before his eyes. Taking advantage of the confusion, Leah ran over to Daniel, helping him to his feet. "We need to get out of here," she whispered. They moved towards the emergency exit, but Stern, recovering from his initial shock, blocked their way. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, raising his gun. Time seemed to slow down. Leah saw Stern's finger squeeze the trigger, heard the deafening sound of the shot. Instinctively, she threw herself in front of Daniel. A sharp pain exploded in her shoulder, and she fell backwards into Daniel's arms. The world around her blurred, voices and sounds blending into a distant cacophony. Leah, stay with me." Daniel's voice seemed to come from very far away. She struggled to keep her eyes open, seeing blurred figures moving around her. Sirens sounded in the distance, getting louder and louder. "Did we make it?" she murmured, her voice weak. "Yes, my love," Daniel replied, his voice breaking. "We did it. It's over." As darkness began to envelop her, Leah had one last conscious thought. They had changed the world. For better or for worse, nothing would ever be the same. And then everything went dark. Dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and red as the final confrontation began. The isolated hut, once a refuge, was now a silent battlefield. Daniel positioned Leah strategically, his voice low and controlled. "No matter what happens, stay behind me. When I tell you, run underground." The first sounds of approach were subtle. The distant squeal of tires on the dirt road, the almost imperceptible movement of leaves being disturbed. Leah felt her heart race, every muscle tense with anticipation. "They're coming," Daniel muttered, checking a sophisticated weapon that looked more technological than a simple pistol. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a deafening explosion. The side wall of the hut simply disappeared, revealing men dressed in black, armed to the teeth. "Jonathan Stern sends his regards," shouted one of them, his voice laden with sarcasm. Daniel pushed Leah back, responding to the attack with surgical precision. His every move was calculated, every shot precise. He wasn't just a criminal or an undercover agent. He was someone trained to survive. Leah, despite her fear, realized something surreal. The bullets Daniel fired looked different. Some detonated in small clouds of electronic smoke, interfering with the attacker's equipment. "State-of-the-art technology," Daniel shouted over the noise. "Designed to neutralize, not kill." One of the attackers managed to get close. Before he could hit Daniel, Leah, surprising herself, hit him with a heavy object, knocking him down. "How?" Daniel looked at her, impressed. "You're not the only one with tricks," Leah replied, a wry smile on her lips. The battle lasted for what seemed like hours, but were only intense minutes. When the last attacker fell, Daniel and Leah were panting, covered in dust and sweat. "Stern," Daniel said, his voice laden with meaning. "He's behind all this." Leah stared at him. Who is Stern really? The answer came not from Daniel, but from a voice behind them. Jonathan Stern was standing at the destroyed entrance to the hut, elegant in his expensive suit, a pistol pointed at them. "Someone you two completely underestimated," Stern said, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. What followed was the real climax, a revelation that would change everything Leah and Daniel thought they knew. Stern wasn't just a lawyer. He was the mastermind behind an international money laundering operation, using Daniel as a piece in a much more complex game. "You were just a pawn," Stern told Daniel, "thinking you were dismantling a system, when in fact you were being manipulated to protect those really responsible." Daniel looked at Leah, his expression a mixture of anger, frustration, and something else, perhaps respect for her own ability to survive. "What now?" Leah asked, her voice surprisingly calm. Stern smiled. "Now you two need to disappear. Forever." The last scene of the chapter froze the exact moment before the final resolution. Stern with his gun drawn, Daniel protecting Leah, and the fate of both hanging by a thread. A perfect hook for the final chapter, leaving the reader/listener completely hooked into the narrative, eager to find out how Leah and Daniel would escape that seemingly impossible situation. The constant beeping of heart monitors was the first sound Leah registered as she regained consciousness. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the soft light of a hospital room. Next to her, Daniel was asleep in an uncomfortable chair, his hand entwined with hers. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He woke up instantly, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. "Leah, thank God you're awake." "What happened?" she asked, trying to sit up. Daniel gently helped her up. "You were shot protecting me. The doctors say you'll be fine, but it was close." The memories came back in a whirlwind. The bunker, the transmission, Stern pointing the gun. "What about the transmission? Did it work?" A tired but triumphant smile spread across Daniel's face. "It worked better than we could have imagined. The whole world is buzzing." He picked up a nearby tablet and handed it to Leah. The headline screamed, "Global Scandal, Corruption Network Exposed. Top politicians and businessmen arrested in international operation. Massive protests demand reforms after shocking revelations." Leah absorbed the news, a mixture of relief and worry taking hold of her. "What happens now? What happens to us?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Well, technically, we're in protective custody. We're the key witnesses in one of the biggest corruption cases in history." Just then, a knock on the door interrupted the conversation. A middle-aged woman wearing an impeccable suit entered the room. "Mrs. Goldstein, Mr. Goldstein, I'm Special Agent Sarah Martinez. I hope I'm not interrupting." Daniel stood up, his posture tense. "Agent Martinez, we didn't expect to see you so soon." The agent smiled slightly. "Things are moving quickly out there. We need to discuss the next steps. Over the next few minutes, Martinez explained the situation. The world was in shock at the revelations. Governments were falling, corporations were being dissolved, and a wave of reforms was being demanded across the globe. You two are heroes to many, Martinez said. But you also have many powerful enemies. We need to ensure your safety. Leah and Daniel exchanged glances. What exactly does that mean? Leah asked. It means you'll have to disappear for a while, Martinez replied. New identities, new home, away from the spotlight while the world reorganizes itself. Daniel frowned. For how long? Martinez shrugged. Hard to say. Months, maybe years. The important thing is to keep them safe until we can ensure that all threats have been neutralized. Leah felt the weight of this reality fall on her. Everything she knew, her previous life, would have to be left behind. What if we refuse? She asked, more out of curiosity than any real intention to refuse. Martinez looked at her seriously. Then I can't guarantee your safety. There are a lot of people out there who would like to see them silenced permanently. Silence fell over the room as Leah and Daniel absorbed the information. Finally, Daniel spoke. We need a moment to discuss this in private, Agent Martinez. The agent nodded, leaving the room. As soon as the door closed, Leah turned to Daniel. What do you think? She asked. Daniel sighed deeply. I don't think we have much choice. What we did changed the world. But it's also put us in the crosshairs of some very dangerous people. Leah nodded slowly. I know. It's hard to imagine leaving it all behind. Hey, Daniel said softly, taking her hand. We won't be leaving everything behind. We'll have each other. Leah smiled, feeling a surge of emotion. Despite everything they had been through, despite the lies and the secrets, she still loved him. Okay, she finally said. Let's do it. Over the next few weeks, as Leah recovered, the world outside continued to be in turmoil. Governments were reformed, anti-corruption laws were passed in record time, and a new era of transparency seemed to be dawning. Finally, the day came to leave. With new identities and only a few possessions, Leah and Daniel boarded a flight to an unknown destination. Sitting next to Daniel on the plane, Leah looked out of the window, watching her hometown disappear under the clouds. Are you sorry? Daniel asked softly. Leah thought for a moment before answering. No, what we did was important. It changed the world for the better. But, Daniel encouraged. But I can't help wondering if it's really over. If we'll ever be able to go back to our normal lives. Daniel looked at her seriously. Leah, what we discovered, what we exposed, that was just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure there's more corruption, more secrets waiting to be revealed. Leah felt a shiver run down her spine. What are you saying? I'm saying that, even in exile, we can continue our work. We can keep fighting for a fairer, more transparent world. Leah considered her words. Part of her longed for peace, for a normal life away from dangers and conspiracies. But another part, a part that had awakened during her incredible journey, was excited at the prospect of doing more, of continuing to make a difference. Are you with me? Daniel asked, holding out his hand. Leah looked at the outstretched hand, then back into Daniel's eyes. In them, she saw determination, courage, and love. With a smile, she entwined her fingers with his. Always, she replied. As the plane gained altitude, taking them to their new home and new life, Leah couldn't help but feel a mixture of apprehension and excitement. The future was uncertain, full of potential dangers but also possibilities. Her journey was not over. In fact, perhaps it had only just begun. On the other side of the world, in a dark office, a shadowy figure stared at a computer screen. On it, photos of Leah and Daniel on their flight. They think it's over, the figure muttered to itself. Little do they know that the game has just begun. The figure picked up a phone, dialing a number. When they answered, he spoke just 4 words. Activate Operation Phoenix. The world had changed, yes. But the shadows of corruption were deep and ancient. And as Leah and Daniel flew to their new beginning, hidden forces were already at work, preparing the next act in this great global drama. The story of Leah and Daniel, the unlikely duo who shook the foundations of world power, was far from over. The future held more dangers, more secrets, and perhaps even greater revelations. The world was unknowingly waiting for the next chapter in this saga of corruption, love, and courage.